we're repeatedly told, is only reasonable. Indeed, a couple of years ago, when a coalition of Dutch politicians, educators, business leaders, and Christian and Muslim clergy announced their intention to try to exclude Geert Wilders from public debate because of his criticism of Islam, they actually described themselves as reasonable people, quote unquote. It was interesting to note that when the so-called Muslim intellectual Tariq Ramadan, who among much else has refused to condemn the stoning of adulteresses, was appointed to a chair at a major Dutch university, none of these reasonable people said a word against it. This was no surprise because it has long since become clear that as far as Europe's reasonable people are concerned, Orthodox Muslims who are openly and actively working to achieve the full Islamization of the West are to be invited into the tent, just as long as they claim to reject attaining this goal through violence. I'm speaking of people like Mohammed Usman Rana, who has been welcomed into the pages of Aftenposten, Norway's newspaper of record, as a regular columnist, even though he has categorically refused to reject the death penalty for homosexuals. Meanwhile, those who criticize people like Rana routinely find themselves being harassed, insulted, misrepresented, and demonized in the same media organs that welcome the views of men like Rana. I live, as I've said, in Norway, which is a small country of 4.5 million people. But precisely because it is so small, it serves as a useful microcosm of what's going on in Western Europe. And I've quoted this before, but I'll quote it again because it's so disturbingly typical of the attitude I'm talking about. Back in 2001, confronted with the fact that 65% of rapes in Norway were committed by quote-unquote non-Western immigrants, which is the Norwegian euphemism of choice for Muslims, Uni Vikan, one of Norway's leading Islam experts, said that, quote, Norwegian women must take their share of responsibility for these rapes because Muslim men found their manner of dress provocative. Norwegian women, she maintained, and this is a quote, must realize that we live in a multicultural society and adapt to it. Then there's novelist Dag Solstad, who was a major literary figure in Norway, and who last year, in a highly publicized speech, argued that free speech is actually undesirable since it drowns meritorious works, such as his novels, presumably, in a sea of vulgarity, a category to which he relegated the Danish cartoons. The former head of the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation agreed with him, complaining in an op-ed about how the Western world has made free speech sacred. He found it scary, that was his word, scary, that some people might actually fight for the right to speak their minds. The world is changing, he wrote. It always has been. Sacred things come and go, unquote. In other words, freedom is a fad, shake it off, move on. In recent months, attacks on freedom by the Norwegian elite have only intensified. First, there was a serious attempt to strengthen the blasphemy law. More recently, there have been calls to rewrite the Norwegian constitution to include multicultural protections for the rights of groups, a change which would involve setting limits on debate and punishing those who offend religious sensibilities. A leading Oslo publisher has suggested that we should, quote, let go of the idea that our hard-won right to offend, wound, and insult our fellow man is a good thing, close quote. Jan Erik Smilden, a former Middle East correspondent for the newspaper Dagbladet, has written that, quote, free speech is an important principle, but it has its limits. In recent years, this very sentiment has been expressed in the Western media by a long list of leading cultural figures. So intense is the pressure to take this sort of position that it wasn't until he was diagnosed with terminal cancer that an environmental activist named Steinar Lem, one of Norway's most outspoken leftist intellectuals, dared to publicly address the threat that the growth and appeasement of fundamentalist Islam in Norway opposed to values like sexual equality, respect for gay people, and the right to criticize religion. This man, who had always seemed a fearless advocate of the causes closest to his heart, admitted that he hadn't spoken up earlier, for one reason and one reason alone. He was scared of alienating his fellow environmentalists and intellectuals. That was last April. He died 3 weeks later. Excuse me for talking so much about Norway, but it is a country that I've come to love. It has become my home, and it is chilling to see it destroying itself right before my eyes. I love Norway too. I love the Netherlands too. And there are many places in Europe that I've come to love. But I've seen across the whole continent that multiculturalism has reaped what it has sowed. The killer of Theo van Gogh was born and bred in Amsterdam. London's 7/7 terrorists were, as the media put it, British lads. Is it any surprise that the children and grandchildren of immigrants, young people raised in a society suffused with a multicultural disdain for its own liberties, tell pollsters in staggeringly high numbers that they would like to see Sharia law in Europe? After all, the people whose lessons about the world they've taken in over the years in mosques and religious schools and Islamic community centers, the people whom they've read on Islamist websites and watched on Al Jazeera and other satellite channels, know what they believe in and stand for. The Al-Qaradawis of this world are not relativists. They aren't multiculturalists. They have a goal and a vision and a determination and a sense of identity and values that Western multiculturalists don't. And they know it. And therein lies their strength. Since 9/11, there have been a number of moments of truth. But in my view, the episode of the Danish cartoons was perhaps the critical moment for the struggle of freedom in the West against Islam and its multicultural appeasers and enablers. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with at least the general outlines of the story. After an editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten learned that the illustrators in his country were scared to draw pictures of Muhammad for an innocuous children's book, he solicited and published drawings of Muhammad by a dozen different cartoonists. Thanks to a concerted international effort by Danish Muslim leaders who were determined to pressure the Danish government into apology and appeasement, their cartoons gained the attention of the world. And in a vivid demonstration of the fact that the appeasement of Islam is not an exclusively left or right-wing phenomenon, the cartoons were condemned by both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, by the Washington Post and the New York Times on the left and the Wall Street Journal on the right, by The Nation and the National Review, by Fox News and CNN. Very few places, very few publications even reprinted their cartoons, which they might have done out of solidarity with their colleagues at Jyllands-Posten, or simply to show the general public what all the fuss was about. In fact, only one major newspaper in the United States, the Philadelphia Inquirer, ran the cartoons, while here in Canada they were published, as far as I know, only in the Jewish Free Press and the Western Standard, both of which were reported to the Alberta Human Rights Commission for doing so. In Europe, to their credit, a few major newspapers reprinted their cartoons, though in all of Britain, not a single newspaper did so. And in Norway, the editor of a tiny Christian newspaper reprinted them, but after a couple of weeks of extreme pressure by people at the very highest levels of the Norwegian government, he caved in and, under the auspices of the Norwegian government, apologized to a roomful of imams for having exercised what he had mistakenly thought was his inalienable right to publish what he wished. In the wake of their shameful and craven response to the Danish cartoons, the Western media and Western leaders have only grown increasingly willing to trim fundamental freedoms to placate jihadists. Again, this is not and should not be seen as a matter of left and right. If many on the left view the criticism of Islam as a violation of the multicultural precept that we in the West have no right to say anything negative about another culture, many people on the Christian right are loath to insult fellow people of faith and thereby invite unwelcome scrutiny of their own religion. And for many people on both sides of the political spectrum, this is, of course, quite simply a matter of fear. And there's yet another factor. Some of you may have followed the recent controversy surrounding a forthcoming book from Yale University Press about the Danish cartoons, a book in which it was announced that the cartoons themselves, absurdly, would not appear. The head of Yale University Press said he feared retribution. Others have pointed to evidence strongly suggesting that the decision not to include the cartoons in the book came from the very highest levels of the university itself and had something to do with the Yale administration's concern about offending Saudi Arabian princes with deep pockets. The powerful impact of Saudi money in the West has already made itself clear. Countless mosques and madrasas in Europe would not exist if not for Saudi money. The Washington Post's resident authority on Islam, John Esposito, is the director of an institute on Islam at Georgetown University that was funded entirely by the Saudi prince for whom it is named and who himself handpicked Esposito to run it. It is one of the most despicable and grotesque aspects of the present conflict that even as George W. Bush sent soldiers to put their lives on the line to fight armed jihad, he continued to be extremely friendly with Saudi leaders who fund schools and mosques and institutions in the West that teach and preach jihad and that give it both moral and material support. So far, those who have taken an open stand against the Islamization of the West have been people more or less identified with the right. For doing so, they've been criticized intensely by many on the left. This is madness, and it only shows how far many people on the left have migrated philosophically from being true liberals. They don't seem to know what liberal values are anymore, and they don't recognize an absurdly obvious threat to liberal values when it's staring them right in the face. To put it simply, this is and should be a liberal battle. A battle for freedom of speech, for freedom of religion, for the equality of the sexes, and the right of people, including gays, to live their lives as they see fit. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, a country cannot remain half slave and half free. Permit tyranny in your midst, and you'll end up tyrannized yourself. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in London and Madrid, in the wake of the Van Gogh murder, and the cartoon riots, and the months of nightly disturbances, complete with cries of Allahu Akbar in the French suburbs, it is clear that the West freedom now comes with an asterisk. In Western Europe,